honorated, nominated for Tony and Drama Desk Awards for his Broadway performance in Joe Turner's Come and Gone. His theater credits rival his film ones. He even won a 2006 Los Angeles Weekly Award for his work as a theater director. Whether on screen or on stage, this talented individual has played a leading role in arts and in diversity. He takes pride in his English heritage, but has been a powerful force in entertainment both here in the U.S. and abroad. On top of all that, he has a special relationship with Sphinx and its Harlem Quartet. He's even served as the honorary chair for the Sphinx Gala at Carnegie Hall. Please welcome our featured speaker, Delroy Lindo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful intro. Thanks. Give me 5 on that. You'd be surprised. People have a tendency to make mistakes. Thanks. I appreciate it. Everybody can hear me? Hang on to the world as it spins around. Just don't let that spin get you down. Things are moving fast. Hold on tight and you will last. Keep your self-respect and your human pride. Get yourself in gear. Keep your stride. Never mind your fears. Brighter days will soon be here. Take it from me. Someday we'll all be free. Thank you. Interpreting diversity. What does that mean to me? It starts in part with exploring the diverse aspects of myself, of who I am. And in that sense, and perhaps for all of us, interpreting diversity starts with self. Mining oneself as deeply and as broadly as possible. Exploring the depth of one's own talents and gifts. And then putting those gifts and talents to work in service of the creative process. Embracing, investigating the diverse aspects of who one is and utilizing those things wherever possible, wherever appropriate, in service of a given project at hand. Now, how does one achieve that when one is working as an interpretive artist, which is to say working on material created by others? To begin with, you have to do the work so that you know that you deserve to be there. And that what one has to offer the work at hand will enhance it, and that you have a right to be there. Nobody's doing you any favors. If one is in a given creative environment, whether it be a chamber orchestra, a chamber ensemble rather, or an orchestra, TV project, a film, or a play, one has to believe that one has a right to be there. Otherwise, simply you wouldn't be there. Now, I've worked interpretively for much of my career as actor, working on material written, created by others. And I've found that I have been most successful in that process when I have found a way to connect personally with the material at hand. And in some instances, when I've connected deeply, deeply personally with the material at hand, and I've been able to merge what I'm feeling, how I am connecting with the material, with the overall viewpoint or viewpoints of the given project. And I'll speak about that in a few minutes. Secondly, in terms of exploring, engaging the diversity of oneself, of myself, I think the ultimate onus on all of us is to create original work. And I'll also speak about my relationship to that in a few minutes. In engaging the process of creating original work, that, I believe, constitutes the freedom that Donny Hathaway was speaking about in the song that I started my presentation with. And that freedom, perhaps another way of referring to freedom, is in independence, if you will. And so that process for me has to do with how I go about establishing my own independence as a creative person. I have to have the faith and the trust that what I have to say is of worth and that there is an audience for what I have to say. So, two aspects. Working as an interpretive artist, interpreting the work of others, and creating original work. Where do I point this thing so the images come up? Point it that way? Okay. Voila. The two projects in the theater that have been among the most successful for me. On the left-hand side here, we see a poster for A Raisin in the Sun. This is a poster from the 1983 production. It was the 25th anniversary production, and it was a big deal. It was very, very important. I was not very good. I was playing Walter Lee Younger. Didn't nail it. In that instance, though, I got a second bite of the apple. Got to play it again in 1986. And in that production, I was able to connect much more personally with the work at hand, with Walter Lee. I made some decisions and some discoveries which resonated for me very, very personally. And I was able to then explore certain aspects of my relationship with my mother. Anybody who's familiar with the play knows that Walter has mother issues. But there's also his father, who's not present in the play, but figures in the play very, very strongly. And I was able to, the second time around, connect much more personally and therefore much more successfully when I got to play A Raisin in the Sun. On the right-hand side, Joe Turner's Come and Gone, the brilliant, brilliant work by Mr. August Wilson. This is an image from a production that I did in Seattle, On the Way to Broadway. And this is probably the most personally that I've ever worked as an actor, working on this play. I connected with some deeply, deeply, deeply resonant aspects of my own life. And I was able to apply those things as I explored my work on Joe Turner. This character's name is Harold Loomis. And as a result of making these very personal discoveries and having the ability to explore those things over 5 productions prior to going to Broadway, it ended up being one of the most profoundly satisfying experiences of my career as an actor. I'm pointing and I'm clicking. There we go. Malcolm X. I played a character named West Indian Archie. Now, even though West Indian Archie is not specified as being Jamaican, I am of Jamaican heritage, and so I made the choice to make him Jamaican. And I got to use a Jamaican accent, and in connecting with that personal part of my own heritage, it gave me a freedom and a confidence as I explored the various other aspects of that character. And so you see where I'm going here. Always for me, the important aspect has to do with connecting personally and mining the various and diverse aspects of who I am as a creative person and applying them to the work at hand. The Cider House rules. I made a very deeply embedded choice as to what I believed was driving that man. And because I was so deeply committed in my choice, it enabled me to humanize the character for myself, and I hope, therefore, for audiences. And despite what he does, I was able to find an area in his arc that resonated to me very, very personally. And that's what I believe enabled me to feel comfortable doing the part and ultimately helped it resonate for audiences. Mr. Rose, Cider House Rules. This is a film called Wondrous Oblivion. Oh, it's an image from a film called Wondrous Oblivion. And here, I also was able to explore my Jamaican heritage. This is a story set in England in 1960. I was playing the patriarch of a Jamaican family. And even though we were not the ultimate protagonist in the film, the fact that I connected very strongly with this story, it is set in a specific place and time, which is to say England in 1960. And it's set in a time when Caribbean peoples, Jamaican peoples, were in the midst of a journey, a very particular time in their history in England. And that era has rarely been represented in film. And because I was aware of that, I was deeply, deeply committed to doing this film. I did this film partially as homage to my mother and to people of my mother's generation. And as such, I had an opportunity to explore certain aspects of my own Jamaican heritage in a very, very deeply personal way. His character's name is Dennis in Wondrous Oblivion. This was an interesting project. Strange Justice. I was playing Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Why y'all laughing? What y'all laughing at? A man who I've never met, but it's safe to say that my political views differ from his own. A man whose experience very, very different from my own. But in preparing to do this work and researching Justice Thomas's background, as well as going down to Pinpoint, Georgia, it's outside of Savannah, and spending time with people who were raised with Justice Thomas, I did, in fact, discover an area of commonality between us in terms of certain experiences he had gone through as a child, paralleled in very broad terms certain experiences that I had experienced as a child. There I found the area of commonality between myself and Justice Thomas, and that became the key to my approaching this character. Because the fact of the matter is, as an actor, and I'm sure any creative people will know that my job as an actor is not to judge the character that I am playing. My job is to humanize the character and share that with audiences. And discovering what I felt were a couple of very specific areas of commonality between myself and Justice Thomas allowed me to, that became the key to my creation of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. So, going back to Joe Turner, this is a man named Harold Loomis. And Harold Loomis has a counterpart in the play, a man named Bynum Walker. You might say he's even a nemesis for Harold Loomis. So I played Harold Loomis in 1988, and in 2010, went to London to play Bynum Walker. And in the intervening years, I had also directed a production of Joe Turner. Now, even though I was working on a different character, the fact that I have such a personal relationship with this play, and this play resonates for me so deeply, in turn informed how I approached working on Bynum Walker in the 2010 production of Joe Turner's Come and Gone. I've included these two images. On the left, yes, on your left, you will see Bynum Walker from the 2010 production of Joe Turner's Come and Gone. And on the right, you will see a character that I created later that same year, Ronan Gibbons, a politician and alderman in Chicago. I include these two images because as I look at these two images, I'm reminded of the muscle that I have developed as an actor over the years. And as a result of exploring, investigating the diverse aspects of myself, that has allowed me to create a diverse array of characters. Very well embodied by these two men, both coming from me and as a result of my exploration of myself in the creative process. Bynum Walker, Ronan Gibbons. So these are just a few snippets of my creative work. Let me spend a few minutes talking about the process for me creating original work, which frankly is much more terrifying. I don't have anything to hide behind. So in acknowledging that it is deeply challenging for me to create personal work, I will also say that I am meeting that challenge in the form of a screenplay that I'm currently writing about my mother and indirectly about myself. The challenge in that process, the challenge to me, is deceptively simple. And that challenge is to be true and authentic to myself. Much more difficult than one might think, difficult for me. Because what I have to do is embrace and negotiate various aspects of my own personal history, my mother's history, and apply that to the creative process. I also have to step outside of various comfort zones that I have protected myself in as an actor in my career all these years. But because I understand that this is the logical next step for me, creating original work, this is what I know I must do. Now, we're all here today, and this is a Sphinx event. And it can be said that Sphinx is the birth, comes about as a result of the work that Aaron Dworkin has done, finding and identifying for himself his particular personal artistic journey and making it manifest in the form of Sphinx. If diversity is the state of being different in appearance, thought, opinions, I'm aware that I have been most deeply affirmed when I have embraced my uniqueness. I have embraced my differentness. When I have done that, and also when I have been embraced by others. That's when I've been most deeply affirmed as a human being and as a creative person. Now, it's been said, excuse me, it's been said that storytelling can change the world. And if that is true, and I believe it is true, then I guess the question for each and every one in this room is, what is your story and how do you tell it? I don't play an instrument, but I am an instrument. I consider myself an instrument. So how do we each play our instruments and tell the story that we want to tell to the world? We're much more diverse in our gifts and talents than we're oftentimes given credit for. And what we have to offer is oftentimes undervalued, even by ourselves. And therefore, the onus is on each and every one of us to believe in ourselves, to embrace ourselves in all of our diversity, to embrace all that's unique and authentic about each and every one of us, and to create from those places. And that is what creates original work. That's what diversity means to me. Thank you so much. Thank you. This way. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Before we move on to the next speaker, we listened to these talks, and I think so much is bubbling in our brains. I just want to give you guys a chance to share any of that with each other out loud. Anything come to mind, anything that you want to get out there. I know it's hard. Nobody wants to be the first one to. I keep doing this to you guys. Yeah. Sure. Yes. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. It's hard to see with the light. Go ahead. Oh, he said he is a finance person and believes the arts will become diverse when the funding for arts becomes diverse. Is that right? Okay. Was there someone over here?
Yeah, I was just going to say that when he introduced all of his work, he talked about how he connected to the different roles. And a couple of those movies I've seen, a couple of characters are, people that I just don't like at all. And so, but he was able to connect with the character. So when we're dealing with these issues of diversity, the barriers to it, if we would do what he did, if we could see where we connect with those that serve as barriers to us reaching that progress, to reaching success in this work, I think that would enable us to be able to communicate, to be the instrument that he described. It could be our way of communicating with that individual, that entity, whatever it is, that has formed this barrier. It will enable us to be able to talk our way through. We'll find a level of connectedness.
Sure. Some common ground.
Some common ground.
Yeah.
We also heard it too from one of the speakers when he talked about how he confronted what was going on with himself. He said that, he had this perception of the black community and he confronted it. So we see it with different different speakers. And I just thought it was interesting to point out that if we do that it will make this fight more winnable.
Yeah. Can everybody hear? Okay. He's talking about finding some common ground with whatever obstacle it might be that's a barrier in achieving that diversity. So kind of finding some common ground and reaching out that way. Anybody else? All right, let's move on because we are about to hear from somebody with 35 years experience in organizational development, artist services, and presenting and producing for nonprofit visual and performing arts organizations. As an independent consultant, she's worked with the Alabama Dance Council, Jumpstart Performance Company, Southern Dance Works, and more. From 1978 to 1991, she was Associate Director for the Contemporary Arts Center in New Orleans. She's also served on and chaired a handful of panels. It's a pleasure to introduce M.K. Wegmann, President and CEO of the National Performance Network, a SphinxCon founding partner.
New York, New York, New York, Connecticut, New York, New York, Michigan, New York, Washington, New York, New York, Colorado, New York, Minnesota, California, California, New York, Louisiana, New York, New York, New York, New York, Oregon. What I just read was the geographic locations of artists awarded grants in a national competitive grant program. I don't need to identify which program this was because I could have picked any list from 4 or 5 different programs and it would read the same. Diversity and inclusion also applies to geography. And I say this to lead into the perspective of the complexity of the issue that we are dealing with. Achieving cultural equity requires a broad and deep analysis of the systems and structures which contribute to an unequal system. The art world is a microcosm of the world we live in, certainly in our country. The issues of diversity and inclusion and equity in our country are replicated in the arts world. Institutionalized racism is a fact. It was constructed over centuries and won't be deconstructed overnight. So the work we do is long and requires a great deal of struggle. I want to identify a couple of characteristics of, from my perspective, the practice of trying to achieve cultural equity. First of all, that the people you are trying to serve, your constituents, should have a voice in the decision-making over the policies which affect their ability to participate and be involved. Second, cultural equity must represent an equitable distribution of resources. It was interesting when I went online to look for definitions of cultural equity. Many of them define cultural equity as supporting everything but work from the European diaspora. I don't take that definition of cultural equity because taking from some and to give to others is not achieving equity. The distribution has to be equitable. Fair does not equal equal. The entire field is undercapitalized. We must have sufficient resources in the field to support us all. It is about making the pie bigger, not divvying up the pie necessarily in a different way. The arts community is divided into silos, and we have to work together to change the issues for diversity and inclusion to achieve cultural equity. There are 2 dictums that I have sort of tried to live by and apply in the work that I do at the National Performance Network, known as NPN. The first is make the road by walking it. You can plan and think and strategize, but until you try to do it, you're not going to know what it takes to make the change that you want to see. And that second dictum is to be the change that you want to see. So when one is in a position to have influence, to lead an organization, to have control over the way things are structured, it is imperative that you apply the changes that need to be made in order to accomplish what you want to set out. Another aspect of a culturally equitable system is it is cooperative rather than competitive. So you have structures that can work with intention, that we can abandon the corporatized structure that is imposed by the 501c3 model, which makes it so difficult for organizations to thrive. We need to create new systems that don't replicate the oppressive conditions that we're trying to redress. I want to acknowledge the shoulders on which we stand in this work for greater cultural equity in the United States. Organizations like Alternate Roots, the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture, the National Alliance of Media Arts and Culture, the American Festival Project, which no longer exists, the National Association of Artists Organizations, which no longer exists, the Network of Cultural Centers of Color, which no longer exists, TAC, Atlatl, the First Peoples Fund, and convening such as Diversity Revisited, the African Grove Institute, and the NPAC, the National Performing Arts Convention that was held in 2008. These are all past efforts to address this issue and to come to grips with what we must do as a community to make change. Stephen Johnson, who recently published a new book called Future Perfect, The Case for Progress in a Networked Age, identified new organizations, fluid, collaborative networks working outside of both the marketplace and the state to improve the world, he called them peer progressives. He said that innovation and progress can come from forms of collaboration beyond the market. For 2 centuries, we have lived in a mass society defined by passive consumption, vast corporate hierarchies, and the centralized control of state power. These organizations didn't seem artificial to us because we couldn't imagine alternatives. Peer networks are a practical, functional reality. The National Performance Network is a network. We're not that new. We're more than 25 years old now. But those aspects of a network of connectedness, relationship building, and persistent work together over time to achieve common goals is a characteristic of how NPN works. And we work with intentionality, a word that has been used a lot over the last day and a half. My definition of intentionality is to first, and this is something that I learned from work with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, is that you do a power analysis. They call it a foot analysis. And that is where you look at a circumstance or a situation that manifests oppression and you analyze it to understand where that oppression is coming from. What are the power dynamics that affect that, that make that result? You also include the voices of those affected by the problem in your analysis so that people are speaking firsthand and, again, having a role in what they do and how the change gets made. And finally, you design a system to address the changes that you want to have happen that is different than the system which is creating the oppression. So I thought I'd give a few examples of how the National Performance Network, NPN, has tried to embed the values of cultural equity and social justice into our structure and practice. Some examples. Cultural equity and social justice are explicit statements in our mission, vision, and values, and we have it at the forefront of however we describe and write about ourselves. Embedded in our bylaws is the phrase, first of all, the bylaws require that the board of directors be a majority of our members, so that the people who are part of our programs, and we are a limited network, we're about 72 organizations around the United States. We're in 29 states and 41 places, rural and urban. So the majority of the board are our members. The rest of the board shall include independent artists, maintain diversity in geography, culture, race, and sexual orientation, and include presenters who range in budget size. So these are the aspects of diversity that we try to address in how we structure our programs. And it starts with the board level and permeates the entire structure of the organization, both our members and the artists that are served through our programs. Early in the NPN existence, we were founded by David White as a project of Dance Theater Workshop in 1985. There was a rule that no more than 50% of the artists supported through NPN's resources could be from New York City. That addresses this recent iteration of the list of grantees in a unnamed national program. And also says that not a lot has changed when a disproportionate share of the resources distributed through national programs go to artists from the New York City area. I don't begrudge them the support. They need the support just as artists do from everywhere else. But I certainly would like to see more artists from, say, Mississippi or Alabama or Louisiana or Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Utah, North Dakota, South Dakota, states that never show up in these lists. One of the strategies that needs to be devised is ways to address the issues that are preventing artists in these other places from being competitive at the national level and understand what programs and support systems can be put in place to make them more competitive. Not change the rules of the programs, but change the system so that more artists have access to these resources. Another strategy that NPN undertook in the 90s was, as we were adding new organizational members, not surprisingly, among the first 19 organizations, 14 organizations that were part of NPN's founding, they were all white organizations. And we, as a network, and I happen to be a member, a staff person at the Contemporary Arts Center, which is one of the founding members of NPN, we together said we want this network to be more diverse and inclusive. And so for a period of 6 years in the 90s, only organizations of color were added to the National Performance Network. And now we have a very diverse and inclusive membership that is more than 45% organizations of color. So by working strategically, we were able to achieve that goal. Another strategy that we undertook was we noticed that very few, no artists from the Midwest during a certain time period were receiving support through the Creation Fund, which is a co-commissioning fund that the National Performance Network offers. And so we added an incentive to presenters if they would commission Midwest artists that increased the match that we made to the commissioning funds, which resulted in an increased number of artists from the Midwest being commissioned through the Creation Fund. Now, so these are some examples of past work that NPN has done to be better at achieving cultural equity. Now, after the long years of the Great Recession that began in 2008, we're seeing the struggles of organizations of color to sustain themselves in these tightened economic times. Some of them are dealing with succession issues. And so we are turning our attention to what we can do as a national network to better support organizations of color that are struggling to survive in this tight financial environment. It is about acting intentionally, and it is about being strategic and how you apply your resources, working from principles of cultural equity, that we're able to achieve what we tried to set out to do. Several references have been made today and yesterday to the National Endowment for the Arts, and which is really such a sad, in many ways, diminution of what its former self was. I've been around long enough, you heard 35 years in the field, of remembering the days when the influence of the National Endowment for the Arts was tremendous across the country in bringing equity to artists and to communities all over the place. Yes, the resources were unevenly distributed. Yes, it was dominated by major institutions. But the panel system and the intentionality of the structures were bringing greater and greater diversity and inclusion to the constituents, to the grantees that the NEA was able to serve. I believe that the culture wars were one of those intentional acts to suppress the diverse voices that were gaining power at the national level because of the support that the NEA and because of the values and principles that panels were bringing to the policy panels and the guidelines that the NEA was operating under in its granting strategies. My call today is for a reinstitution of a robust national endowment for the arts. As a country, if we're going to achieve greater cultural equity, it needs to be led at the national level. And it needs to be led with money behind it, significant money behind it, because that is what makes people react and change. If you know that your scrutiny, your funding is going to be scrutinized if on the basis of your equitable application of your programs and sources, that with public money that comes from the public, that comes out of all of our pockets, that money should be returned to the country as a whole and should be distributed equitably. And I really believe that a more robust and refinanced National Endowment for the Arts is a vehicle for making that happen. So as we move through this day and a half, these two and a half days rather, addressing the issue of cultural equity, I hope that we can find strategies that will solve the problems, but recognize that it's 400 years in the making of the oppressive systems that have led to the inequitable relationships that exist now, and that we have a long way to go. Thank you.
Being a trombonist trained at the Manhattan School of Music and the Juilliard School is impressive in and of itself, but that doesn't begin to cover this next guest's accomplishments. He's held leadership positions from coast to coast in places like the Seattle Symphony, the American Composers Orchestra, and the New York Philharmonic. As Executive Vice President and Managing Director of the League of American Orchestras, he was instrumental in creating new programs. In 2008, he took over as President and CEO. Please welcome Dr. Jesse Rosen of the League of American Orchestras, a SphinxCon founding partner.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm not a doctor. Never was, and I can't even say my mother would be happy to hear that I was a doctor because my mother was a modern dancer. So she's very happy that I'm in the arts, and my dad was a bass player. He's happy too. So I'm no orchestra guy, and beginning last evening at the first break, through every break, and through last night after the thing, and then this morning in the breaks and the lunch, and just 15 minutes ago in the break, friends and colleagues have come up to me with expressions of sympathy and condolences and complimenting me on my patience as I've listened to everything going on. And I'm really, really touched. I mean, it's nice to hear all these lovely things. But it's not necessary. I mean, I'm delighted people are talking about orchestras so much. It's a good thing when people talk about us. And also, you know, as Jim mentioned before, of the over 200 people here, 30 of them are from orchestras and other classical music organizations. And 4 of the League's own board members are here. Bob Pizer and Helen Schaffer from the Houston Symphony, Ann Parsons from the Detroit Symphony, and Aaron Dworkin from Sphinx. So we're feeling we're in a place of warmth and an important conversation. I'm very happy to be here with everyone. Let's see if I can do this. So far, no. I'm doing what you told me. Oh, right button. Ah, okay. This is James DePriest, and many of you know him. He was a wonderful, wonderful artist and musical leader. He passed away about a week ago. And this picture, I didn't pick this for its composition or its, you know, the clarity, but I don't know if you can see in Jimmy's eyes, but Jimmy was just a remarkable person. He was deeply humane, compassionate, serious, and there's a kind of depth and sympathetic qualities as you look at Jimmy. And Jimmy spoke at the League Conference in 1988 in Chicago. He was the keynote speaker, and this was a time when there was a lot of concern about the financial condition of orchestras. I'm not sure when there was a time where that wasn't a big topic, but it was raging then. And Jimmy made a really important observation and perspective that he shared with everyone. And that was, he talked about the fact that there were really 2 bottom lines. There was the financial bottom line that everybody talked about and how important it was to keep that bottom line balanced. But he cautioned orchestras to not get so swept up in that they lost track and lost sight of the artistic bottom line, and that we avoid getting into artistic deficits. And for Jimmy, the primacy of the music itself, of the experience between performer and orchestra, was truly in the heart of his worldview. And Jimmy was a person of great integrity and a person of great authenticity. And I mention this because I think these qualities of authenticity and integrity are really central to any effective work that happens in performing arts organizations that have anything to do with diversity and inclusion. And I want to share a story with you that, for me, exemplifies some of those qualities. It's a little bit of a long story, but it's an important one. And this is a story about a performance that I went to at the New Jersey Symphony almost 20 years ago. The work was by an African-American composer, Hannibal Lecumbe, and I went because I knew Hannibal. I knew him because when I ran the American Composers Orchestra, we commissioned his first orchestral piece and subsequently performed it at a League conference in New York in 1992, I think. And when we played it in New York, it was an instant hit, and it received 80 performances by U.S. orchestras over the next 3 years, making Hannibal among the most programmed living American composers. So I was anxious to go to the concert in New Jersey, and he was commissioned by the New Jersey Symphony to write a piece based on the life of Medgar Evers. And Hannibal, in creating the piece, traveled to Mississippi so that he could talk to people who were there and get firsthand accounts. And he is still a wonderful promoter in a very organic way. He managed to get the Newark Star-Ledger to send a reporter with him who sent back reports of Hannibal's work in Mississippi and the conversations he was having. So a number of articles began to appear in the paper. And then, I don't know if this was Hannibal's idea, but somebody figured out with the performance, the world premiere approaching, that the idea of freedom was something that clearly this piece was going to be about. And so every high school in Newark was asked to have their kids enter an essay writing contest on what does freedom mean to you. And so there were, building up to the concert, daily, these essays were being published in the newspaper. So finally we get to the performance, and it is a completely full house, and it is clearly a majority African-American audience in the house. And Hannibal comes out on stage, and he gave a blessing to the concert. And I'd never heard a concert get blessed before. I have since then, but this is the first time I heard a concert get blessed. And the blessing was so wonderful. He said he wanted the blessing to be for the youngest person in the audience and the oldest person in the audience. And as soon as he did that, everyone started looking around and wanted to, where are those people? And this created this amazing sense of knowing who you were next to and seeing them, and also, you know, this wonderful, intriguing thought that somebody in that concert hall was going to be hearing for the first time this whole experience. And somebody else is going to be hearing this music and this performance through a lifetime of performances, of music, of all kinds of life experiences, and how different that experience was going to be. So before a note was even played, Hannibal had us all, you know, kind of eaten out of his hands and feeling very, very good about what was going to happen. So the concert took place. I won't say anything about it because it was a concert, and it was wonderful, and people were moved and excited, exalted. It was a tremendous performance. But afterwards, they had what we would today call a talkback, and so there was you know, Hannibal and the conductor and the choral conductor and so on and so forth. And but Hannibal also brought someone he met in Mississippi when he was working on the piece. He brought Emmett Till's mother. And for any of you who don't know, Emmett Till, I believe, was the last person lynched in the United States. He was, I think, 16 years old. He was in Mississippi. He lived in Chicago, and he went to visit a cousin. And Mrs. Till described the experience of her son's body coming back to Chicago, and that it came back in 4 boxes because the body had been so badly mutilated. And a short time after this, I mean, the conversation went on, and a young woman raised her hand, and she said she was 11 years old, and she sang in the chorus. And she said she never knew who Medgar Evers was, And she only found out about him by singing this work. And she said as she got to know the story from being at the rehearsals and learning her part, she began to develop a feeling about the people who killed Medgar Evers. And she said the feeling was one of hatred, and that she wanted to do to them what they had done to him. And she said that that evening in the performance, as she was singing and as she was listening and being part of the whole experience, she had kind of a question came into her mind. And her question was, if I want to kill them because they killed him, how am I different from them? And this was just an extraordinary moment where you saw a young person coming to grips with a profoundly important moral dilemma. And all of us left that evening feeling some combination of being of raw and kind of open and hurt, and at the same time a great sense of having shared in this experience together and that people were able to talk about it. The overwhelming feeling I had, though, when I left was, this is really weird. This is a symphony orchestra concert, and I'm being brought into direct contact with people and a set of issues that have been so central to the life of our country and the experience of people living in it. And I've never been so connected and had been touched in so many ways by this experience. And I think, I mean, who knows what other people thought. That's what I thought. And it was a very, very powerful, powerful event. And it took place at a symphony orchestra concert. Now, I mention this because since then, I think that if you would look at symphony orchestras around the country, and you would look at the Houston Symphony with its new music director, Orozco Estrada, and Giancarlo Guerrero in Memphis, Mayan Chen in Chicago, Giancarlo Guerrero in Nashville, and Mayan Chen in Memphis and Chicago, Delta David Geyer in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Gustavo Dudamel, Marin Alsop, Laura Jackson in Reno. We are seeing a change in the musical leadership of America's orchestras. And it's one being brought about from the very center of the organizations, from the artistic leadership, who are bringing a much broader creative palette and a sensitivity to either where they came from or where they currently are living, and see that as a central part of their roles as musical leaders. And what I'm presenting to you is a very different picture of American orchestras than what you saw yesterday when Aaron was sharing these statistics and Paul was sharing his observations. And I don't think these two views need to be reconciled. I think they are two simultaneous realities about what is happening in orchestras today. I know that what Aaron shared, I know the data is right because it's our data. And I know that Paul's observations are on target because many of them were taken from a speech I gave to our membership about 2 or 3 years ago. So these are, in fact, I believe, two realities. And so the question is, so what do we do? And the reality I just shared is, I will say, is a very small step up a very big mountain. But we got to get up the mountain. And Aaron posed an interesting question yesterday, the role of policy in affecting change in this area and moving us along faster. It's a very interesting question. And I think it gets us out of the, as Horst was saying, the deficit gap and into the opportunity gap. So one of the pathways, I think, that is just one of many, but it's, I think, an important one, is this question. I would take it from policy to boards, because where is policy set? It's set by boards of trustees. A recent Demos study of 14 major New York cultural and arts organizations showed that less than 3% of their boards were comprised of African Americans in New York City, with a 64% African American population. At the League, we decided that diversity had to take on a bigger life in our own planning, in our own thinking, in our own work. And we were fortunate that at this juncture when we did this, Board Source had just developed a new assessment tool, board assessment tool on diversity. They asked us if we would be interested in piloting it, so we did. And the results of that assessment was the beginning of the League's own internal discussions about diversity. And these were very difficult discussions because we started by asking people to talk about their own experience. And in our board, we have, a lot of diversity. We have gender diversity, we have sexual orientation diversity, not age diversity. We do not have ethnic diversity in significant numbers. We have ethnic diversity, and people talked about their various feelings, what they thought it meant, and we knew in order for us to make any progress, we had to arrive as a group as to what we thought diversity meant. So the big piece of work initially was just for the board together to arrive at a definition of diversity. We took a very broad one that was very inclusive of all kinds of difference in our country. We also set in motion a work group that continues to work and has worked very assiduously on our governance committee, which is where our nominating function takes place, and has been building our pipeline to include more diverse trustees for the League board. And our work group also has started to create, we just launched this about 2 or 3 weeks ago, a Diversity and Inclusion Resource Center, which is on our website. And this is a first step, a small step, but a very important one. And what we wanted to do is to simply gather all of the material, because there's a lot of material. There's a lot of important work that's been done that people don't know about, and so we wanted to get it all in one place. This is on our website at AmericanOrchestras.org. And this is, that's kind of on the home page. You can see all these different categories that we've identified, and those are all, you click on those and you go down deeper, and this is what you'd find if you went on the governance page, which includes a number of board source resources, something from the Pittsburgh Symphony. We have the NCRP report, which has been a big subject of conversation within the League and among orchestras, and so on and so forth. So there's a long way to go, but I don't think we should miss the important progress being made and look at where we see important opportunities happening and not be discouraged by some of what has occurred in the past. I was at the Oakland Symphony's opening concert earlier this season. They had an audience that represented their community. It was largely African American, and they had an orchestra with one African American on the stage. So we have, we're going at multiple levels, and some pieces are going ahead of others, but we need to keep going. And as orchestras keep going, I want to just build on Jim's invitation and just suggest that when this orchestra ad hoc group convenes tomorrow at noon, let's not have it be only an orchestra group. We need to talk with one another about these terribly important issues. So this is an open invitation to anyone who wants to join that conversation. Jim, I'm sorry I didn't ask permission, but I think it'll be an important addition to the discussion. So in remembrance of James DePriest, I thank you very much for your time. Bye-bye.
I wanted to ask you guys, as we talk about diversity, what are some different aspects of diversity that you don't always think about? There's race, gender, and can we get a handheld mic on the floor, our DPTV friends? Over here? Public school versus private school. Do we have that mic available for anyone else? Yes, if you could just project.
Ability.
Ability. Geographical. Yeah.
Also the tendency to hire artists of color only in February.
Good political move, right? Or they think. She said the tendency to hire artists of color in February. Yes. Diversity in programming. Anyone
That
else?
religious diversity often does not include people that are non-theistic or non-religious.
Okay, so not only religious diversity, but diversity that applies to those that choose not to have a religion.
Diversity in training of your craft. Sometimes there's snobbery, the trained versus the natural talent.
Yes, right here.
Different teaching styles. How we have people that learn more visually and some that learn by reading, and we don't have that in our educational systems too much.
Yeah, thanks. All right. By the way, if anyone wants a doctorate, I'm handing them out. Our next presenter started her career as a program representative for UCLA Extension's Department of the Arts, later becoming head of the American Film Institute's West Coast team. As director of the Independent Filmmaker program, she established herself as a major leader and fundraiser in the field. She's also led the development of an eco-leadership forum that advances the agenda of culture futures, transitioning to an ecological age by 2050. Now an independent consultant advising the DeVos Institute for Arts Leadership at the Kennedy Center, she also sits on several cultural boards. Please welcome a Sphinx organization board member, Sandra Gibson.
Thank you. Thank you. I realize I'm the last in a long list of speakers today, and I'm separating you from drinks and dinner. So know that I'm aware of that very keenly. Well, emerging trends and shifts in the marketplace and in our communities continue to shape and reshape the cultural landscape and the context in which we work to engage people in the arts. And I think we have an opportunity to rethink the terrain in the work that we do, especially as we think about how to enable creative capacity in our communities and in individuals, which I think is our work. We all know the big trends. Technological advances, networks enable reach and collaboration. There are blurred lines between sectors, blurred lines within sectors. Civic engagement and volunteerism is actually on the rise, but different. We have vast demographic shifts and new demands for participation. So by 2050, we've heard the statistics, there'll be no single majority population in the United States. And already today, that has implications for what we describe and define as mainstream, dominant, and in the margins, and raises questions about how we're going to embrace this vast diversity on its own terms. We all have new imperatives to respond to demographic shifts, to expand our definition of diversity, and as we're going along, to demonstrate the kind of project and impact that we're having. So the work of the traditional work and dynamics of increasing participation and engaging audiences in the arts is naturally challenged in all of this, and should be, because the work of synchronizing the performer, the artist, and the audience in space and time has new solutions that don't depend on our organizations, our programs, our venues, or our marketing. So I think organizations and leaders have to incorporate a framework for diversity in their work. I think we need mission-driven and strategy-driven arguments for inclusion, not moral arguments that say this is the right thing to do, and not transactional responses. We have to move beyond representational and generational diversity to the deep, long, and hard work of building the kind of knowledge and understanding that allows us to really embrace and nurture the creativity and vitality in our communities. That's simply it. You know, I've thought about the many times I've been engaged in this conversation on diversity for some 30-plus years, how much cultural sensitivity work I've done on my own with groups, with organizations, in communities. And every time the conversation, I've got to say it's engaging. More and different people come to the table and join in. But we still raise the same questions. What should we do about diversity? What more can we do? Are we having any impact? And what I'm starting to hear a lot of lately haven't we already done diversity? As if diversity was some thing, some it that we take on and put off, pick up and put down when it's convenient, when market conditions are favorable. Diversity is. Sekou Sundiata, the late poet, musician, activist, and writer, headlined Diversity Revisited. And this was a day-long convening that was organized in reaction to what was billed as the first ever gathering of national arts leaders from across a spectrum of performing arts disciplines. Now, in fairness to the organizers, the spectrum of performing arts disciplines wasn't defined, it wasn't limited, but many of us began to notice that there were artists, forms, cultures rooted largely outside the Eurocentric traditions and aesthetic that weren't part of the conversation, that actually weren't at the table and might not be part of this historic gathering. So we said, maybe we should organize a meeting alongside. And a number of us got together, invited 50 organizations committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we said, we got to check in ourselves on this. How are we talking about this? And can we raise the level of conversation to active coalition building so that when we talk about arts and civic engagement, we are talking about it for all? So I want to read a little bit from his speech because I think it's relevant today. What do people of color have to talk about that they are not able to address at that convention? The elephant in the room for me is the pattern of exclusivity and invisibility in the production and distribution of arts in the United States and American society. So for Sekou, he said, this people of color convening is just part of a history of subjugation to white supremacy and colonialism more than anything else. So he said, let's lift ourselves. Let's get out of the baggage and the terminology we've been using. True diversity in theater will come when we take this to the level of democracy in the arts. A democracy of ideas that is expressed through different voices, different cultures, a humane social practice that elevates and promotes the best in individuals, while forcing us to think of each other as different and as the same at the same time at a fundamental level. So we thought, wow, we got to take this apart. We spent the weekend unpacking it, breaking it down, and talking about how do we do this work differently ourselves. We had respondents, we had breakout sessions, and we talked about my favorite, the 4 F's. And the fact that if you have these 4 F's down, food, fashion, festival, famous people, sounds funny, but it's a concept that if you had these 4 F's down for ethnic groups, you'd be culturally literate. You would be considered understanding diversity. No matter that these reductive identities, these sort of skin-deep identities, box us in and actually deny the legacy of innovation that's part of any living cultural tradition and that produces artists that are outside the main route. And we know that race is a fault line in the United States. Race enters into every conversation when we talk about diversity and stays there. So when we talk about diversity, we have to talk about all aspects of diversity. And we have to consider the subtle points of intersection between us all. Just a few years ago, Arena Stage took up the conversation of diversity in the theater in 2009, and then they had another series in 2010. And they did this over a series of weekend encounters. I went to all of them, did some public forums. The first one, Defining Diversity. And the theater makers from a wide variety of backgrounds right away said, you know, this term and the definition doesn't address the conversation in any way. And they were actually talking about tokenism in hiring, staff that are hired in their institutions still today to fill a diversity quotient, not because they have any power or authority to enact any change. They talked about the disconnect with mission, the fact that diversity isn't part of achieving the mission, therefore is not a priority. A couple weekends later, 30 black playwrights sat around a circle and talked about the complexity of relationship building with black, ethnically specific, and mainstream American theaters. And we said, you know, this is 21st century. Why isn't this just American work? And artist and activist writer Pearl Cleage got up and she said, look, I wasn't raised to be an American. We used to tell people we were from Detroit. That was it. I kid you not, this is what she said. And she said, okay, if Barack Obama is the president of the United States, and this is my president, then I got to be American. But what does this mean? A person who wasn't raised to be American. What does this mean for my work? What does it mean if I'm just a writer? If I'm a woman writer? What does this mean for the love stories I tell? What does this mean for the stories I tell about family? What does this mean for the other work that I'm doing? And she said, we don't need to worry about whether they accept our work or value our work or whether they can understand it. We know we're human. We never doubted it. So again, like Sekou, this idea of the humane practice, this humanness, this connection to our humanity. I don't know if you can read the definition. So I think this is about really beginning to embrace the practice of cultural competence. And I'll read it for those of you who can't see it. And this comes from Patricia Saint-Onge. She's a great colleague who runs 7 Generations Consulting. She's got a book out she put out with a group of collaborators a few years ago called Embracing Cultural Competency. A way of being in the room, bringing your whole self to the encounter and seeing everyone else in their complexity and delighting in that complexity. And I love that last phrase, delighting in that complexity. This is a quest. This in it is intentional, real interest in knowing yourself and knowing about others. Many organizations in this room have been working over time to change the cultural practices and the cultures in their organizations, and some with great success. I mean, the landscape is littered with the success stories, the failures, and the lessons learned from these experiments over decades. But we still have to address the big questions around equity, justice, race, gender, age, marginalization. And we have to be open, inclusive, and commit to the process of bringing people, their realities, their perspectives, and differences together. And this is challenging. It's complex, long-term work. To achieve cultural competency, we have to consider context, community, and change. One project I want to say a little bit about that I think early on, about 10 years ago, did this was the Floating Box. This brought together 4 disparate organizations that had one goal in mind. We want to share the personal stories and histories of the people of Chinese descent in Chinatown in New York. So Asia Society, Meet the Composer, the Museum of Chinese in America, and the Music of China Ensemble got together and commissioned a chamber opera from Jason Ka Huang and his librettist, Catherine Fallu. And Jason and Catherine collected these stories in the community, 3 generations of people, their stories, their poetry, their song. And the community was so honored to have their stories reflected in this work. And the lasting tribute is, this is the cover of the CD box that was just released late this past year. The lasting tribute to their contribution to the work was to have their oral histories recorded as part of the CD box and as part of this work. But I think what's interesting about this is this next chart. Asia Society, the dominant organization in this relationship, and this is really emblematic of the work of Rachel Cooper, the performing arts curator there. This is part of her ethos. She said, we've got to change the power dynamics. We can't come in with our big organization, our big footprint. We've got to be another organization at the table and pay attention to the shared goals in the center. And everyone at the table worked very hard to do what I called negotiate the equivalences. They worked to build trust, reciprocity, and openness, no matter how disparate the individual contributions of each partner, to make this partnership, which was multi-year, really work. Active Arts at the Music Center. It's a final example before I close. Active Arts at the Music Center began from the realization of another great colleague, Josephine Ramirez, when she arrived as the VP of Programming. And her realization, after having lived in Los Angeles for a long time, that the Music Center, this public county facility, big concrete in the middle of downtown LA, that a lot of people who lived in Los Angeles, and many of the people who lived right around the center, had no relationship with it, didn't see themselves in it, and in some cases didn't even care. And she began to think, what is the offer we can make to people of Los Angeles that lets them know this is your place? The Music Center is yours. What is the way that we can begin to connect and be believable and have a relationship with this community? So she got a carve-out of funds from the operating company. The money and the program was hands-off to the resident companies in terms of marketing, promoting their programs, fundraising, and even the sharing of lists. This was a by, for, and organized by and for the community on its own terms. So Active Arts still goes on, and we're going to pull up the video now of public practice.
Good morning. This is Public Practice, the program of Active Arts at the Music Center. What we're going to do is put you in 2 different places today. Let's get you situated. And this is designed to give you a feel for what it feels like to practice, either observed or unobserved by people walking by.
My name is David, and I'm a fine artist. I draw pictures that hang in galleries. Rex, you stay with me.
Since as long as I can remember, I've just been nuts about music.
I put it off way too long, and so it was nice to finally, as an adult, to say, I'm going to do this, and I don't care if I'm good or bad or anything. I'm just gonna do it.
Hello, my name is O.C. I usually work in a grocery store. When I'm practicing, I just kind of freeform. I don't know what it is, but maybe just seeing this incredible building in front of me, I think things are starting to wake up now.
What I love about this is amateur musicians practicing all around the Music Center. Of course, the Philharmonic, when they first heard about it, was obviously concerned. They didn't want anybody to be mistaking these amateur musicians for the orchestra members. But, when you do these things in a big institution, you seriously, you have to negotiate the equivalences inside and with the community as well. And it all worked out. And they worked out a schedule so that it could be properly identified. Well, I'm going to close with a video clip. That's why the sandwich boards were there. A video clip that just took place a few weeks ago. And this was during Jazz Connect. This was a 2-day conference alongside APAP NYC, put together by Jazz Times Magazine and the Jazz Forward Coalition. And I'm a member of the coalition and ran this plenary where we asked a number of jazz greats to talk about what inspired them along their journey. And I leave you with this little 2-minute and 15-second clip from Arturo O'Farrell, the great band leader, because it's so, I think, exemplifies what we're talking about here today. And his identity, his journey is all wrapped up in this music that he's incurably in love with. And I think it's a demonstration of the power of the arts to connect us as human beings and to tell our stories and to reveal our identities. Thank you. Go ahead and bring that video up.
Wow. I'm so lucky. I've never been in the coveted critics' polls. I'm not the darling of the critics. Too young to be a legend. Too old to be a young lion. I'm not an institution or part of one. I haven't won this or that competition. I didn't go through this or that jazz program. Not quite black, but not quite white or enough. Even my Latin brethren aren't sure what I am. Mexican, Cuban, Irish, what the hell is my problem? Then there's the issue of what exactly is it that I do. Am I a pianist, a band leader, a composer, son of a composer? If they can't seem to figure it out, why should I? Man, am I lucky. Then there's the matter of my music. It's all over the place. I'm one of these guys that connects the dots between Sun Ra and Jimi Hendrix, Steely Dan and Albert Ayler, the Art Ensemble of Chicago and Lupe Fiasco. My art reflects that, even though some insist that jazz is strictly this or strictly that. I don't fit neatly into this or that bin, and neither does my music. This used to bug me out. The fact that being anything other than a jazz musician mattered, that no matter how organic, thoughtful, and heartfelt your art, there was a list of peripheral credentials that affected your career. You had to look right, come from the right pedigree, play someone else's definition of the music, and be a spokesperson for a very specific, narrow viewpoint. I'm not that person. Don't interview me if you want the official position. Don't ask me to decide, decipher, denote, or deliver the definitive opinion of what jazz is or isn't, or even if it exists. I leave that to the adults. I'm not that spokesperson. I'm not that authority, that arbiter, that gatekeeper, or that source. What I am is someone who is incurably in love with a vast infinity, an endless source of divine wonder. I don't use jazz to affirm my opinions, to justify my politics or my views on rampant, unbridled capitalism. I don't use it to soothe, affirm, or placate me, or to soothe, affirm, or placate my listeners. I use it to challenge my complacency and my self-righteousness. That's what happens when you face infinity. Your viewpoint becomes meaningless. What matters is your entry point into that infinity.
Well, a couple quick things, and then we'll be off for a dinner break. Comment cards. I know I've been saying this a million times. I'm just the messenger. Please fill those out. In fact, if you want to take them out right now and maybe jot some things down that are fresh on your mind. Another change in the program for those of you who missed it. The event tonight is at Volt Bar rather than Coach Insignia. And finally, if you reserve tickets for the Sphinx Competition Finals concert, pick that up at the registration booth. We'll see you back at 7:30.